The wind howled across the dry Montana plains, rattling loose boards and tugging at Clara McKee's shawl as she stood at the edge of her land, hammer in hand. Her belly, round with late pregnancy, pressed uncomfortably against her faded apron. But she ignored it. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale orange glow over the jagged hills beyond, but Clara was already at work. She had to be. Her boots sank into soft mud as she trudged along the broken fence line, inspecting the sagging wire and leaning posts. One of the cattle, her only remaining steer, had broken through in the night. Again. Damn you. Laroy, she muttered under her breath, not sure if she was cursing the steer or her late husband, who had insisted this land could be tamed. James had been dead for 4 months now. The accident was quick and cruel trample during a cattle stampede after a gate malfunctioned. Clara had buried him under the cottonwood near the creek, the same spot where they'd picnicked after first staking. Their claim. A simple wooden cross marked the place, and some wildflowers she'd gathered still wilted at its base. She hadn't wanted to stay at first. Everything reminded her of him. The squeaky porch board he'd never fixed. The half-built chicken coop. His coat still hanging behind the door. But leaving meant giving up. On James, on the child inside her. On the land they'd nearly killed themselves to clear. So she stayed, and the land, it seemed, was determined to fight her. The fence was just the latest battle. Clara dropped to her knees in the dirt, breath shallow. Her hands were blistered from days of work, and her back ached from the weight she carried. Still, she pulled off her gloves, reached for the hammer, and drove a nail into a crooked post. Her strikes were weak, but she kept swinging. She had no family nearby. James's kin were all in Missouri and had never approved of their move west, or of Clara herself, for that matter. And her own parents had died of fever before ever knowing they'd be grandparents. She was entirely alone now, save for the growing life inside her and the memory of the man she'd buried. The wind kicked up suddenly, stinging her eyes with grit. She blinked hard, trying not to cry. Crying wasted water, and water was too precious. Suddenly, the sound of hooves echoed on the hill above. Clara stiffened, one hand still on the post. Visitors were rare, and uninvited ones were rarely good. News, she turned slowly, one hand on the small knife tucked beneath her apron. A lone rider sat atop a dark bay horse. The man didn't approach. He watched from a distance, hat pulled low, reins held loosely. Clara couldn't see his face clearly, but she recognized the silhouette. Eli Harper, the quiet rancher from the land west of hers. She'd seen him once at the supply store in town, tall, weather-worn, and so silent it made the air feel heavier. When he walked in, folks said he'd lost a wife and baby years ago, though no one knew how. He lived alone, worked alone, and rode into town maybe twice a season. Clara narrowed her eyes. "What do you want?" She called, shielding her eyes. Eli didn't answer. He tipped his hat slightly, then nudged his horse into a slow turn and rode off along the ridge, vanishing over the hill like smoke on wind. Clara stared after him for a long moment, confused, then turned back to her fence. Maybe he was just checking the border. Maybe he pitied her. Or maybe he was just another ghost watching from the edges. She stood up, her legs trembling, and steadied herself against the post. One fence at a time, 1 acre at a time, one breath at a time. She whispered to her belly, "You hold on in there. Baby, Mama's not giving up." As the sun climbed higher and the wind roared through the trees, Clara lifted the hammer again. The fence had to hold. If nothing else did, the fence had to hold, because Clara McKee, pregnant and widowed, wasn't leaving this land. Not yet. Eli Harper sat astride his horse, shade on the rocky ridge that overlooked Clara McKee's land. From here, he could see everything: her sagging barn, the weedy rows of her half-planted garden, the rusted windmill that turned only when the gusts were angry enough to force it. And there, near the fence line, was Clara herself, hammering away like she had nothing left to lose. He watched her for the better part of an hour, saying nothing, doing nothing. Just watching. It wasn't nosiness. Eli hated gossip and avoided people who fed on it. This wasn't even pity, though maybe some would call it that. It was recognition. That woman down there, fighting the land with blistered hands and a child swelling in her belly, she reminded him of someone, of another stubborn soul who wouldn't quit until the land bent to her while Sarah. He blinked the name away before. It hurt too much. His wife had died 6 years ago, their newborn with her, taken by fire and smoke and the kind of bad luck that comes without warning. Since then, Eli had built his life small and quiet. He fixed fences. He tended cattle. He kept his mouth shut and his heart sealed even tighter. And yet, there he was, watching Clara McKee. He'd known her husband James in passing. Decent man, always polite. Bit of a dreamer, like most who tried to homestead out here. They'd bought land that needed too much work and had no family backing them. It wasn't a surprise when things went bad. What did surprise Eli was Clara's choice to stay. Most widows would have gone back east, baby or no. But not her. She'd planted her boots in the dirt like the roots of one of those cottonwoods, near her creek. Still, she was losing. Eli had seen her trip over loose stones,
fall to her knees, cry when she thought no one was looking.
He'd noticed her limp, the way she gritted her teeth when bending. She was close to giving birth, yet here she was, wrestling barbed wire and trying to dig fence posts in hard, cracked soil. It stirred something in him, something he didn't want to name. Shade snorted beneath him, ears flicking. Eli gave the reins a light tug, turning the horse downhill. He didn't plan to speak to her, just get a little closer. Maybe drop off some lumber tomorrow or leave a few coils of wire near the fence line. Nothing that said pity, just help. As he approached, Clara turned, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "What do you want?" she called, hand going toward her apron like she might be hiding a weapon. Eli didn't blame her. Out here, a woman alone couldn't afford to be soft. So he didn't answer, just tipped his hat. He considered saying something, "You shouldn't be out here alone. That fence needs 2 pairs of hands. You and the baby don't deserve this kind of fight." But the words felt too heavy, too personal, and too late. Instead, he turned shade and rode the edge of the property line, keeping her in view for a while longer before disappearing over the hill. Back at his own ranch, Eli dismounted and led Shade into the small barn. The place was clean but quiet, filled with the stillness that only comes when no one's laughed or spoken inside in years. He unsaddled the horse, brushed him down, and paused at the tack wall. A length of barbed wire hung, unused in the corner. He stared at it, then grabbed an extra post hole digger and set it beside the wire. He didn't know why he did it. Habit, maybe. Or a plan forming that hadn't quite turned into words. That night, as he sat on his porch and ate beans from a tin, Eli couldn't shake Clara's face from his mind. Sun-reddened, streaked with dust and sweat, but full of fight. She was losing, maybe, but not quitting. He understood that better than most, and somehow, without deciding exactly why, he knew he'd be back by morning. Not with a speech. Not with promises. Just with hands that could help if she let them. The morning wind was bitter, even for mid-June. It carried the sharp scent of sage and the distant dust of cattle hooves from somewhere west. Clara McKee stood once again at the broken edge of her fence, her breath tight in her chest. The wire had snapped clean in 2, curling like a snake ready to strike. It was the 3rd time that week. She crouched slowly, every movement now deliberate, her belly a growing weight that made the world smaller, slower. The baby had been kicking more. Lately, rolling beneath her skin as if restless in the cramped space. She muttered under her breath as she tried to grip the coiled wire with trembling fingers. Her gloves were torn at the fingertips. Her palms stung. Her back ached. Still, she worked. She hooked the wire onto the post and reached for the fence stretcher, trying to lock it into place with shaking hands. The wind jerked at her shawl again, and for a second, the tool slipped. She stumbled, caught herself on the fence post, and sucked in air as pain lanced through her hip. Keep going, she told herself. Just hold the line a little longer. She didn't see the split in the post until it gave under her weight. One side cracked with a sickening snap. The post wrenched sideways, dragging the wire with it, and the sharp edge whipped out like a whip dotted. Sliced across her forearm. Clara gasped, falling to her knees as the pain seared hot and sudden. Blood welled instantly, soaking into the sleeve of her dress. Her vision blurred. The ground tilted. For the first time in weeks, she let out a sob. Not the dry-eyed silence she'd been forcing, not the quiet tears in the barn at night. This was a sound from deep inside, the sound of a woman pushed past her limit. She was alone, bleeding, 9 months pregnant, and miles from help. Then came the sound of hooves. She turned her head weakly toward the noise, blinking hard. A dark horse was approaching fast down the hill. Rider hunched low over the saddle. She tried to push herself upright, but her legs were useless beneath her. The rider pulled up short, dust kicking around them. Clara's heart leapt in panic, but then she saw the familiar hat, the weathered duster, and those serious eyes that gave away nothing. Eli Harper. He dismounted in one swift motion and crossed to her without a word. His eyes flicked to the bleeding arm, then to the coiled wire, then back to her face. He said nothing, just knelt and pulled a folded bandana from his pocket. "I'm fine," Clara whispered, her voice thin. "Just a scratch." He didn't respond. With careful hands, he wrapped the fabric around her arm, tying it tight but not cruel. She winced, but he didn't flinch or apologize. He just worked like a man used to patching things, horses, fences, wounds. When she tried to rise, he caught her gently beneath the elbow and helped her to her feet. She wobbled but stayed upright. "I told you," she said, breathless. "I'm fine." Still nothing from him. Just a quiet look that said he didn't believe her for a second. He helped her toward the nearby log where she could sit, then walked the line of the broken fence in slow, measured steps. Clara watched him, half irritated, half relieved. He didn't touch anything yet, just surveyed it, like a man reading a story only he could see in the sagging posts and curled wire. After a long moment, he returned. "Bad angle on the slope," he said at last. His voice was low and rough from disuse. "Too much pull on that post. Needs to be reset deeper, reinforced at the base." Clara stared at him. It was the most she'd ever heard him say, "I know how to fix it," she replied stiffly. He gave her a long look, unreadable. Then he nodded once and walked to his horse. From the saddlebag, he pulled out a fresh coil of wire and a small toolkit. Clara frowned. "You were planning on coming?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he crouched beside the damaged post and started clearing the dirt. Clara watched, confused, torn between pride and gratitude. "You can't do all this yourself," he finally sighed, not a judgment. Just a plain, spoken fact. She looked down at her arm, at the faint red soaking through the bandana, then at her swollen belly, and the unfinished fence that now stood between her and survival. "Maybe not," she whispered. Didn't smile, didn't press. He just kept working, and for the first time since James died, Clara didn't feel quite so alone. Clara woke to the sound of hammers, not her own. She blinked against the early morning light, her injured arm throbbing dully beneath the bandana Eli Harper had tied the day before. For a moment, She thought she'd dreamed it. The quiet cowboy riding in, fixing her wound and saying more in 10 minutes than he probably had all year. But the rhythmic thud-thud outside was real. She pulled her shawl tight over her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch, one hand resting instinctively on her swollen belly. Eli was already at work. He didn't look up as he drove the new fence post into the dirt, shoulders steady, movements practiced. A pile of supplies, wood, wire, even a post-hole digger sat nearby, far more than he could have brought on a single trip, which meant he'd come back after she went inside. In the dark, Clara stood silently, unsure of what to do. It had been so long since someone showed up without wanting something in return. She was used to salesmen, prying neighbors, men who smiled too long at her belly and said things like, "A woman shouldn't be alone out here." But Eli didn't speak. He just worked. She walked down slowly, boots crunching over dry grass. "You're back," he nodded once without pausing. "Fence needed fixing. I could have handled it." He finally looked at her, calm, unreadable. "You were bleeding yesterday," Clara exhaled, sharp. "That was one time." He knelt at the base of the post, twisting the wire around the braces. "You'll need this line strong. Come calving season, you'll want to keep the coyotes out." Clara hesitated. "I don't have any cattle left but one steer." "You will," he said simply. She studied him as he worked. Everything about Eli was quiet, not just his voice but his movements, the way he occupied space without filling it. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer unwanted advice, and didn't look at her like she was some fragile thing about to break. That alone set him apart from every man she'd met since James died. She lowered herself to sit on an overturned bucket near the post and winced. Eli glanced at her belly for a half-second, then looked away respectfully. "You live alone?" she asked after a moment. "Yeah. Always have?" "No." That answer hung in the air like smoke. She didn't push. His silence wasn't cold. It was careful, deliberate, and she understood that kind of silence. She'd lived in it for months now, talking only to the wind, the chickens, and the child growing inside her. "What's your horse's name?" she asked, a gentler question. "Shade." Fitting. He smirked, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth. It disappeared so fast Clara almost wondered if she imagined it. They worked in companionable silence for a while. Clara fetched nails and held spare wire when her back allowed. Eli never asked her to. He simply worked as if her presence made sense. When the sun climbed higher and the wind warmed, he straightened and rolled his shoulders. "You got water?" "Rain barrels near the shed." He nodded and walked toward it without asking for permission. Clara watched him go, her thoughts a tangle of confusion. She didn't know what Eli wanted. He hadn't asked for payment or thanks. He didn't flirt, didn't even linger when their eyes met. He just showed up, did the work, left quietly, and somehow that unsettled her more than 100 bold words ever could. By evening, the entire west fence line stood repaired. Taut wire gleamed in the low sun, and the new posts sat firm in the ground. Eli packed up his tools, his movements just as unhurried as when he arrived. Clara stood at the gate, arms crossed loosely over her middle. "You planning to come back tomorrow?" He paused, considered. "If you want. I didn't ask you to come today." "No," he said. "You didn't." She looked at him hard, waiting for any sign of motive. But he just nodded once, mounted shade, and tipped his hat. Clara called after him. "Why are you doing this?" Eli turned in the saddle. "Because someone should." Then he rode off, disappearing into the same hills from where he came. And for the first time since James died, Clara felt something shift. Not relief, not safety, but a crack in the armor she'd been wearing so tightly around her heart. The letter had been tucked deep in the back of James's old desk, behind a stack of his seed catalogs and a dried flower pressed flat between two books. Clara found it 2 days after Eli had finished the west fence line. The envelope was yellowed, the paper worn soft with time. It was addressed to James McKee, stamped from the First Territorial Bank in Helena. The date in the top corner stopped her cold. April 2nd, just 3 days before the accident. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The words on the page hit like a kick to the ribs. Final notice. Unless outstanding payments are received by the end of the month, your loan will be foreclosed. This property, including the acreage, livestock, and structures, will be reclaimed by the bank. Clara sank onto the floor, heart pounding. James hadn't told her. He hadn't mentioned any debts, hadn't warned her they were running out of time. He'd kissed her forehead that morning, promised to bring back flour from town, and then he'd died, leaving her with a crumbling house, a single steer, and now the threat of foreclosure. Clara read the letter again, as if it might change. But it didn't. The land was slipping through her fingers. She pressed her hand to her belly, panic swelling. "I can't lose this place," she whispered. "It's all I have left of him." She didn't cry. Not this time. She was too angry. At James, at herself, at the bank, the wind, the hard soil that refused to grow anything. All of it. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, then stood and went to find the tin box she kept under the floorboard, her emergency stash. She counted the coins and crumpled bills by the flickering lamp. $18.43, not even close. The next morning, she was pulling weeds from the garden when she heard hooves again. She didn't even look up this time. "Fence doesn't need fixing today," she called without turning around. "I didn't come for the fence." Eli's voice answered, quiet as ever. She looked up, squinting. He'd brought a sack of seed, a wrapped bundle of firewood tied behind the saddle, and something else, something folded, stiff. It looked like a map. He dismounted and walked over, setting the bundle of seed near her porch without a word. "What's that for?" she asked, brushing dirt from her palms. "Carrots, squash, and barley. Hardier than what you've got in the ground." "You didn't have to, I know." He unrolled the map next, smoothing it on the porch rail. Clara stepped closer, frowning. It showed her land and the property line between her and Eli's, but someone had drawn new markings, an area that overlapped both pieces with fresh boundary lines in red pencil. "What is this?" "My eastern pasture," he said. 30 acres. Runs alongside your field. Good grazing land. Water access. I've kept it empty since last year." She stared at the map, confused. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to have it." The world seemed to stop. "What?" She said flatly. "I'm offering it to you," he repeated. "You need land to raise that child, to grow a future. And that piece ain't doing me much good anymore." Clara stepped back as if slapped. "I don't want your land." "It's not a gift," he said, still calm. "It's a start. You can pay me when you're able, or work it through trade. I don't care how." Clara's face hardened. "So this was pity all along?" "No," he said quietly. "It was respect." They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind tugging gently at her shawl. Clara wanted to scream, to run, to throw the letter in his face and tell him she didn't need saving. But part of her, an exhausted, desperate part, wanted to say yes. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the bank letter. She handed it to him without a word. He read it, jaw tight. "So now you know," she said, voice shaking. "I'm losing the place. Maybe it's better if I do. Maybe this land wasn't meant for me." Eli looked up, eyes steady. "Maybe it was meant for both of us." Clara stared at him, stunned. Not because he was offering her land. Not because he'd seen the letter. but because those words had weight, not romance. Not promises. Just possibility. She took the letter back and folded it slowly. I don't want charity, Eli. You're not getting charity, he said. You're getting a fighting chance. Then he mounted his horse and rode away again, the dust swirling behind him. And Clara, still clutching the map and the letter, stood on that porch with the sudden realization that something had shifted, not just in the dirt or the fences, but in her heart. The next time Eli came, Clara didn't meet him at the porch. She was in the barn, trying to wrestle a bag of feed off the shelf without tipping the entire rack over. He stepped into the doorway without a word, his shadow stretching long across the dusty floor. She didn't turn. If you're here to offer me more land or another sack of seed, I'm going to throw this bag at your head. I'm not, he said. But if you keep tugging that bag, you might throw your back instead. She sighed, breath short. I can still do things. I never said you couldn't. With a nod, he stepped forward and lifted the feed down for her like it weighed nothing. Clara stepped aside reluctantly, arms crossed, watching as he sat. It neared the trough with quiet precision. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the stall door. Why are you really doing this, Eli? Don't say it's because you respect me. He didn't answer right away. He removed his gloves, dusted off his coat, and finally looked up at her. His eyes were unreadable, but his voice had a crack and said it now like something inside him had finally worn thin, because once, a long time ago, someone fought like hell for a life we never got to finish, and I didn't step in. I just stood back and watched her fall apart. Clara's arms slowly uncrossed. Your wife? He nodded. Her name was Sarah. He paused, as if saying her name aloud stirred something sharp. Then he continued, quiet and even. She wanted to homestead, same as you and James. Said we could raise cattle, start fresh after her first miscarriage. I didn't think she had the strength for it. I didn't believe in the land like she did. So I let her carry the dream while I stayed cautious, careful, cold, even. He rubbed a thumb across the crease in his glove. One winter, stovepipe cracked. I was out checking fence posts. By the time I got back, the house was gone. Clara's breath caught. And she? He nodded once. She and our son, both gone. Silence swallowed the barn. Even the dust motes and the shafts of sunlight seemed to freeze in the air. Clara whispered, I'm sorry. Eli's jaw flexed. I never rebuilt that house. Never took another woman. Never tried again. I figured the land beat me. And I let it. He turned to face her. But I saw you, Clara. Saw the way you kept working after James passed. The way you held that broken fence together with nothing but wire and fury. And it looked a lot like Sarah, only this time I wasn't going. To just stand back and watch someone lose everything. Clara swallowed hard. I'm not her. No, he said. You're not, but you're fighting the same fight. And I've got hands that can help, land that's not being used, and more fence wire than I'll ever need. If I can give someone a piece of what I couldn't save, maybe it's not for nothing. She didn't answer right away. The walls of the barn suddenly felt smaller. The air too thick. Clara had carried her grief in silence, convinced no one else understood. But Eli's sorrow was deep and wide and strangely familiar. You really think we can make it out here? She asked, voice hoarse. With a baby and one steer and a half-dead garden? He gave a quiet shrug. You've already made it this far. That counts for something. Clara looked at the feed, the clean stalls, the repaired barn door he'd fixed last week without even asking. She saw suddenly the outline of something she hadn't dared imagine in months. A future, not a rescue, not a romance. Just the possibility that she didn't have to do this alone. Her voice softened. I don't know what to say. Don't need to say anything, he said. But if you want that eastern pasture, I'll draw up papers, something fair. No handouts. Just neighbors helping neighbors." She nodded, then added quietly, maybe you don't have to stay a neighbor." Eli looked at her, eyes steady. "Not if you don't want me to." They stood there, grief between them like a road well worn. But for the first time, Clara didn't feel like she was walking it alone. Clara paced the porch, the worn floorboards creaking beneath her boots. The wind was high again, whipping her braid across her face as she clutched the contract in her hands, a simple sheet of paper Eli had drawn up himself. 30 acres. Water. Rights included. No charge up front. Payments deferred until harvest or stock matured. Nothing binding, he'd said. Just an offer. But to Clara, it felt like more than that. It felt like a weight pressing on her chest, heavier than the child. She carried Eli was in the pasture near the barn, adjusting a gate hinge he'd noticed was crooked. She watched him for a long moment before marching across the yard, the paper crumpling slightly in her grip. "This isn't right," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. He glanced up, calm as always. "What isn't?" "This." She waved the contract. "This land, the help, all of it. It feels like charity. Like I'm a project you've taken on." Eli stood slowly, brushing dust from his jeans. "It's not charity. Feels like it," she snapped. "I didn't come out here to have someone carry me. James and I," her voice faltered, "we wanted to build something. With our own hands. If I take this from you, what does that say about what I promised him?" Eli took a slow step forward. "You promised to build a life, not to break yourself doing it alone." Clara looked away, jaw tight. "You don't understand." "I do," he said, and something in his voice made her look back. "I've stood in ashes where a house used to be. Held on to silence because it was easier than feeling like a failure. I've known what it's like to stare at land you love and feel like it's swallowing you whole." He paused. "So don't tell me I don't understand. You don't want. Charity, fine. Then don't take the land. Work it." She blinked. "What? I've got stock I need grazed and you've got time and grit. Work the land, split the calves come fall. That's no handout." "That's a partnership." Clara narrowed her eyes. "Why are you trying so hard to keep me here?" Eli shrugged. "Maybe because I see something in you I lost in myself. Maybe because this place is better with you on it. Or maybe I just believe you're strong enough to deserve more than survival." His words caught her off guard, quiet, but full of conviction. Not flattery, not a promise of protection. Just truth. Honest and unvarnished. Clara looked down at the contract. Her fingers loosened around the crumpled edge. "All right," she said after a moment. "I'll work it." Eli nodded. "Good. But I'll be the one mending the fence lines, tending the pasture, and tracking the calves. I won't be sitting in the house waiting for someone to bring me water." He gave the faintest smile. "Wouldn't expect you to. And I'm not moving into your cabin or letting you build something for me. I stay here, on my side. Then I'll keep fixing what's broken on both sides," he said simply. "That includes busted hinges, you know?" Clara rolled her eyes but didn't stop him when he turned back to the barn and kept working. That evening, she sat on the porch with her hands resting on her belly, the contract beside her, now signed with both their names. The wind had calmed, and for the first time in weeks, the air smelled like coming rain. The fields stretched quiet around her, and she imagined them filled barley waving in golden rows, a small herd grazing by the stream, a child's laughter. Chasing chickens through the yard. It wasn't the future she'd pictured with James, but maybe it could still be a good one. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Eli walked up the path. He stopped at the bottom step of her porch and looked up, not demanding, not waiting for anything. "I'll be by tomorrow," he said. "We'll start laying irrigation along the ridge." Clara nodded, a smile ghosting her lips. "Just don't get any ideas about doing it all yourself." Wouldn't dream of it. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked into the dusk, and Clara, feeling a little steadier, leaned back and whispered to the child inside her, "We're going to make it. Baby, one day at a time." The rain came suddenly, pounding down in thick silver sheets that blurred the land into one moving wall of water. It hadn't rained like this in months, maybe longer. The skies had teased for weeks with dark clouds and dust storms, but now the real thing had arrived, furious and full. Clara stood at the window, hands pressed to the sill, watching her newly dug irrigation trenches flood faster than she and Eli could have ever planned for. She felt both relief and dread. The lamb needed this. So did she. But if the storm lasted too long, her small vegetable plot, just beginning to sprout with green, could wash away overnight. "Damn," she whispered. A hard knock hit the door, and she turned just as Eli burst in, soaked to the bone. His coat clung to him like a second skin, mud streaked up his boots and pant legs. He shook his hat off and set it on the hook, water dripping from its brim. "Creek's rising fast," he said, catching his breath. "Field's already under 2 inches. Clara moved to grab her shawl. "We need to clear the lower rows. If the trench clogs, everything's gone." "You're not going out in this," Eli said firmly, stepping in her way. She shot him a glare. "That's my crop, my food. And my baby doesn't need a starving mother. You're carrying another. Life, Clara. You don't have to." "I do have to," she snapped. "Because if I don't, who will?" Eli stared at her for a long moment, then exhaled hard. "Fine, I'll get the trench. You guide me from the porch." Without waiting for a response, he turned and vanished back into the rain. Clara stepped out under the awning, rain slicing sideways through the wind. From there, she shouted instructions, watching Eli work like a man possessed, hauling debris, digging runoff channels with a spade, using his own boots to stomp deeper grooves into the clay so the water would flow away from her vegetables. She could barely hear herself think over the storm, but somehow, through it all, she saw what no words could have shown her. This man wasn't here out of obligation or guilt. He was staying because he wanted to, because he'd chosen her. And this land, and the child she carried. By evening, the worst had passed. The skies opened to a red sunset streaked with purple, and the first stars blinked through the clearing clouds. The fields were soaked, but intact. The crops survived. The trenches held. Clara was still on the porch when Eli returned, drenched again, hair clinging to his forehead. She met him with a towel and a blanket, silent as she wrapped them around his shoulders. "You didn't have to go that hard," she murmured. "I did," he replied softly. "Because you don't have to do everything alone anymore." Clara blinked away the sting in her eyes. Her throat tightened. "You keep saying things like that, like I should just let you in." Eli met her gaze. "I'm not trying to take over or replace what you lost. I just want to help build what comes next." She lowered her eyes, her hand resting instinctively on her belly, and right then, so clear it made her gasp, the baby kicked. A solid, sure thump beneath her ribs. Eli's eyes widened at the sound, his gaze dropping to her stomach. "Was that?" Clara reached for his hand without thinking. She guided it to the side of her belly, holding it there. A long beat passed. Then it happened again. The child kicked, hard, strong. Eli's fingers trembled slightly. Against her, neither of them said anything. There was no need. In that moment, soaked in the aftermath of a hard storm, they both felt something shift, something bigger than rain or fear or even grief. It wasn't romance yet. It wasn't love, but it was hope. Real, solid hope with a heartbeat of its own. That night, Clara left her door unlocked for the first time since James died, and Eli, instead of heading for his own land, slept in the barn just steps from the house. Not because he had to, but because he was truly staying for her, and for the life they hadn't quite named yet. The next morning broke soft and golden, the storm's rage replaced by gentle warmth and a sky scrubbed clean. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings, of something Clara hadn't let herself hope for in weeks. Peace. She moved slower. Now, not from exhaustion, but because every step felt like part of something delicate and real. The baby was more active than ever, nudging and rolling, reminding her of its presence with each subtle shift. She stepped onto the porch and spotted Eli already awake, standing in the pasture with a piece of fence wire looped in his hand, watching the morning mist lift off the hills. He'd slept in the barn, she knew, just far enough to respect her space, but close enough to make her feel protected. He turned when he saw her and tipped his hat. Clara raised a hand in return, a smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was the beginning of something understood. Later that day, they walked the field together, inspecting the aftermath of the storm. The trenches had held. Her vegetable rows were damp but intact. Even the barley seed she'd planted had sprouted tiny green shoots. Poking defiantly through the mud. They talked in quiet bursts about irrigation, CLF sharing plans, how to fence in the east pasture. Every word was practical, grounded. But each one layered trust where there had once been silence. Clara paused near the old cottonwood, the same one where James was buried. She looked toward the simple wooden cross, now slightly tilted from the rain. "I should fix that," she murmured. Eli stepped up beside her. "He'd be proud of you, of how hard you're holding on." She didn't answer for a moment. Her fingers grazed her belly. "I think," she said softly, "he'd be surprised I made it this far." "You're stronger than most men I've known," Eli replied. "James knew that. I can see it in the way he left things ready for you." Her eyes welled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she reached for a flat stone nearby and used it to firm the base of the cross. Eli crouched down without being asked and helped realign the wood, pressing it deeper into the soil. When they were done, Clara stood slowly, wincing as the baby kicked again, hard this time, right beneath her ribs. She gasped and instinctively grabbed Eli's arm. "There it is again." He looked at her, eyes wide. She took his hand and placed it carefully over the spot where the baby had just moved. And just like that, the child kicked again, strong and certain. Eli let out a stunned breath. "That's real." Clara laughed, the sound catching them both off guard. It was the first full laugh he'd heard from her, bright, breathless, and unburdened. "Yes," she said. "That's our reality now. No room for quitting." His hand still rested gently on her belly, but he looked at her, not the child. And something passed between them in that moment. Not need, not rescue, not desperation. Connection. Not because either of them were perfect. Not because they were trying to fill old voids. But because, slowly, without either of them noticing, they had built something steady. Something earned. That evening, Clara cooked stew with the last of her potatoes and carrots. Eli brought in firewood without being asked. When she handed him a bowl, he took it with a quiet thank you and sat across from her at the kitchen table, the one James had built by hand. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of presence. "Have you thought of a name?" Eli asked, glancing at her belly. She shook her head. "Not yet. Doesn't feel right to choose it alone." He nodded. "Fair enough." She set her spoon down. "Would you want to help? Pick one when it's time?" Eli looked up, eyes steady, voice low. "If you'll have me?" The room grew still. Clara reached across the table, laying her hand gently over his. "You're already here," she said. "I think I just needed time to believe it." Outside, the wind had died. The fences held. The soil was soft. And inside, something deeper had taken root, more enduring than words. Clara McKee's child was born on a soft morning in early August, just as the sun was rising over the ridge. The birth was long, painful, and raw, but when the cry filled the room, strong and full-throated, Clara felt something inside her finally give way. Not weakness, not fear, relief, and joy. It was a boy. Eli was waiting just outside the house, pacing quietly beneath the cottonwood tree. He didn't ask to be in the room. He hadn't even tried. But he'd built the crib from pine slats with his own hands, brought herbs from the widow west of the river, and fetched the midwife 2 days before without Clara even having to ask. When the door finally opened and the midwife stepped out, smiling and wiping her hands on her apron, Eli straightened. She nodded. Healthy boy, and she's fine. Exhausted, but strong. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Thank you. She asked for you, the woman added with a quiet smile. You can go in. The room was warm and still, filled with the scent of lavender and wood smoke. Clara sat propped up on pillows, cheeks flushed, her hair damp with sweat. In her arms, swaddled in a patched wool blanket, lay the child. Eli stood in the doorway for a moment, his hat clutched in his hands like he didn't know where to fit in this moment. But then Clara looked up, and the way she smiled tired, but sure he knew he belonged there. Come meet him, she said softly. He stepped forward, heart thudding. The baby was so small, yet so alive. Dark hair, eyes closed, a tiny fist curled against Clara's chest. Eli had never seen anything more fragile or more powerful. He's got your nose, he said quietly, and your stubborn kick. Clara murmured, a small smile playing at her lips. Eli said gently on the edge of the bed, Have you chosen a name? She looked down at the child. I was thinking, James Eli McKee, after the man I lost. And the man who stayed. Eli's throat tightened. Clara, you don't have to say anything, she said quickly, tears springing to her eyes. But you should know, this child wouldn't be here without you, not just alive, but safe. This home, this land, this chance. You gave me more than help. You gave me back hope. Eli reached out slowly and touched the baby's tiny hand. The boy's fingers curled instinctively around his. It was the first time Eli had felt peace in 6 long years. I never thought I'd have this again, he whispered. Clara looked at him, her voice low and full of quiet fire. Maybe we were both meant to start again, just not alone this time. The weeks that followed were a blur of feedings, fence checks, and long nights under the stars. The land, freshly soaked by the rains, responded with life. Barley growing tall, vegetables bursting from the garden, the herd growing fat on rich grass in the eastern pasture. Clara worked where she could, with the baby swaddled in a sling across her chest. Eli split his time between his cabin and hers, but more and more. His boots found their way to her porch every evening, until it no longer felt like 2 separate lives at all. They shared meals, plans, and silences that no longer needed filling. Theirs was not a love of grand gestures or soft words, but of shared burdens, earned trust, and hands that never let go. By autumn, a small carved sign appeared at the property gate. Mecky Harper Ranch. It wasn't a claim or a branding. It was a promise. 2 names, side by side, building something new from the broken pieces of their past. And every morning, before the sun rose over the ridge, Clara would wake, look down at her sleeping son, and know she had not been rescued. She had rebuilt. With grit, with grace, and with the quiet cowboy who never once tried to take the reins from her, just rode beside her through the storm.